I think there's two important myths to correct. The first myth is that the transition process began in 1992 and destroyed the basic infrastructure of the economy. In reality, the Russian economy had already collapsed. Attempts at reforms throughout communism had been exploited by insiders, and that set the context for transition. The second big myth is that the transition process created a stable class of oligarchs that then came to dominate Russia. In reality, the oligarchs didn't take over the government, they got taken over by the government. And for the few years that they did have immense control over Russian politics, while they skimmed off a lot of national wealth and skimmed a lot of money, they also led important corporate turnarounds, which need to be looked into in more detail. According to Catherine Belton, the freewheeling oligarchs of the 1990s were soon brought to heel. It had taken just one big case against the country's richest man for Putin and his men to rein in the market freedoms of the Yeltsin era and to launch a takeover by the state. In the alternative history of Russia, the question isn't what if the oligarchs didn't come to power, but what if the oligarchs had actually come to power? Let's go back to the earlier attempts to reform the communist system. Gorbachev was in a situation where he was trying to reform a completely broken country. There was a moribund economy, corrupt party functionaries, demoralized workers, declining global status, and a threadbare Marxist-Leninist ideology. Zubok argues that the Soviet Union collapsed due to Gorbachev's botched reform program rather than any systemic contradictions. And let's think about this. The key reform that Gorbachev put into place was the 1987 Law on Socialist Enterprises. I'll extensively quote Caldwell, who says, "Half understanding how capitalism worked, Gorbachev authorized state administrators to create an economy of socialist democracy. Unbelievable though it seems, managers of state enterprises were permitted to establish their own banks, which they could then borrow from, and to establish joint companies with foreign partners. Executives could sell state assets to themselves or their partners at artificially low state-fixed prices, and then sell them on to third parties at the market price. The word cannibalization can be used to describe the process. Exporters accumulated fortunes that were hidden abroad by using mechanisms that the KGB had developed to pay for industrial espionage. That stands to reason for, in the early stages, who but the KGB knew how to set up a shell company in a tax haven? Who knew how to buy a mansion through a trust? According to Peter Rutland, Gorbachev decentralized decision-making to the enterprise level and allowed the emergence of small cooperatives. We can view this as a fundamental problem that gets exploited by insiders and oligarchs, or we can also see it as a fundamental contradiction in the attempt to rehabilitate a communist system that was fundamentally unworking and unworkable. It does demonstrate, though, that prior to transition taking place, we see these reforms being made in the system that was opening up the scope for exploitation. Corruption played a very important role prior to the transition process starting. Illicit barter operations occurred under Brezhnev since the 1970s. The state oil export monopoly delivered oil to Finland, where the origins would then be disguised and sold on via intermediaries in exchange for embargoed technology. Friendly firms were crony companies at the heart of the vast system of black market operations that kept the Eastern Bloc afloat, according to Catherine Belton. She also said they created an invisible economy, which was a network of firms and joint ventures that protect and hide the party's financial interests, as Gorbachev's reforms sent the country hurtling into chaos. Notice that transition was preempted by the foreign intelligence parts of the security services because they could see the failings of the system as well as being in a position to exploit them. Examples were transfer pricing schemes where commodities get sold through middlemen and traders at low domestic prices, netting the difference with the foreign global price. These schemes were essentially arbitrage schemes that benefited from the artificial price controls at the time. This window of transition, therefore, was open before Yeltsin was in power. From 1988, state enterprise managers had been gradually taking on ownership of the enterprises that they were supposed to be managing. This was a kind of personal privatization process. According to Caldwell, the looting of Russian state enterprises and national resources is commonly associated with the administration of Boris Yeltsin after 1991. But the mechanism for that looting was put in place by Mikhail Gorbachev. In our time, oceanographers, visitors, videos posted online have allowed many people to watch an 800-pound octopus escape a ship's cargo through a hole the size of a quarter. The law on socialist enterprises was like that quarter-sized hole. Through it, the octopus of Soviet Union's GDP escaped into Swiss bank accounts, American hedge funds, and London townhouses. Now, who were the looters? The nomenclatura. The black market and the KGB are inexplicably linked. The KGB always had close control of the black market. According to Anton Surikov, it was impossible to work in the black market without KGB connections and without protection from the KGB. Without them, no shadow business was possible. The black market was not only necessary to fill the shortages of the command economy, but it became a KGB-cultivated petri dish for the future market economy. This was the beginning of the Soviet state, according to Catherine Belton, the beginning of the looting of the Soviet state. The black market experiments were the beginning of the sudden acceleration in the transfer of the Soviet Union's vast wealth into KGB-associated friendly firms. Corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain. Key causes are complex regulations, a lack of competition, the absence of an independent judiciary or a free press, and faulty democracy that leads to a lack of electoral competition. The extent of corruption after 1989 declined significantly where democratization and where market liberalization came early. Corruption was rising where the transition process was lagging, according to Oleg Havlichin. Corruption didn't start during transition. It was endemic under communism, in the words of John Pfeffer. Workers stole from their workplaces, party officials profited from their positions, and bribery greased the wheels of an inefficient economy. The political transition taking place at the time was from Gorbachev, who represented the crumbling Soviet monolith, to Boris Yeltsin, who was responsible as the face of the fledgling Russian nation. In terms of the rise of Yeltsin, one institution that is incredibly important is the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic Congress of People's Deputies, which Yeltsin, through sheer political instinct, in the words of Caldwell, transformed from a kind of citizens' forum into the dynamic core of an alternative Soviet government. He established the position of president within the Congress, got himself elected to it, and then used it to delegitimize and undermine every institution on which Soviet power rested. Yeltsin was well placed to win the presidential election with 57% of the vote that took place on June 12, 1991. He stood as an outsider and defeated the former communist Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov. At the time, Yeltsin's focus was threefold. One, wanted to secure his power. Two, he wanted to peacefully dissolve the Soviet Union. And three, needed to deal with the rampant economic crisis. He said, "We have a unique opportunity to stabilize the economy within several months and start the process of recovery. We've defended political freedom. Now we have to give the people economic freedom, remove barriers to the freedom of enterprise and entrepreneurship, offer the people possibilities to work and receive as much as they can after having relieved them of bureaucratic pressures." What he didn't do was major political reform. He didn't provide a new constitution. He didn't dissolve parliament. He also didn't abolish the KGB. He did split it into 5 separate agencies, and he reduced the headcount by half. But of those new agencies, such as the FSB, which was the domestic arm, the FSO, the presidential security arm, and the SVR, the foreign intelligence, those bodies became very important later on when Putin takes power. The time in Russia, particularly Moscow, is characterized by a kind of gangster capitalism. Murder on the streets is being caused by the collapse of the state. It wasn't purely due to a lack of funding as a consequence of Washington-imposed austerity measures. It was the absence of state institutions, which meant that there was basically breakdown in civil order. When we think about who is in the process of wanting or resisting change at the time, you can imagine you've got the elite at the very top, and they want to preserve the existing system. You've then, at the kind of second and third levels, got the people who benefit from perestroika and want more liberalisation. And then underneath that, you've got the general public. Catherine Belton says the country fell apart because these people from the second and third echelon had no interest in that system surviving. They'd figured out the way of surviving better in the new system. Privatisation plays a critical role here. When state enterprises were privatised, the best place to benefit were those who already exploited perestroika. These were, to quote Belton, the young businessmen from the Komsomol, the black marketeers, the organised crime groups, the KGB and the state directors. Perhaps Yegor Gaidar, who was the economic advisor to Yeltsin, perhaps his biggest mistake was acting as if the problem of transition was to try to move from the situation circa 1987. By the 1990s, the Russian economy was in a very different situation. It had already begun this spontaneous transition and therefore trying to restrict things from 1987 and use that situation as the context was possibly a mistake. That doesn't necessarily mean that transition was a mistake, just means that the starting point was perhaps the wrong one. The basic process was firstly to establish a co-op. So this was a kind of an attempt, an ability to intermediate between state firms. Then secondly, to buy a state enterprise and use that state entity to invest the profits in the bank. And thirdly, to develop some inside connections to take advantage of the large asset privatizations when they occur. Having the co-ops, having the state entity, having the profits from the bank, and then having the inside connections was the basic process by which people benefited from this. Gorbachev had set up the cooperatives, of course, in 1987, 1988, which allowed private company shells to exist. When we think about Russia, I think a big question is, did shock therapy actually take place? For example, one of the big problems in Russia was budget deficits. The economic advice, and the economic advice consistent with a radical transition plan that typically is known as shock therapy, is to respond to that by cutting government spending. That's a kind of austerity argument for dealing with budget deficits and fiscal ill discipline. But Russia didn't do this. They didn't adopt widespread spending cuts. Instead, the policy choice was to print money to cover the deficit, to fund government spending through control of the printing press. The outcome, as any economist would predict, is hyperinflation. But that hyperinflation that's being driven by monetary stimulus is not consistent with the economic advice at the time. It's also important to note that Gorbachev and Yeltsin's decision to ban alcohol sales and privatize state assets had reduced tax revenues, and that was having a negative impact on budget finances. Jeffrey Sachs argues that the advice he gave to Poland contributed to Polish shock therapy, but he points out that the same advice that he was giving to Russia was being less adequately received. According to Sachs, the advice that I gave: eliminate price controls, stop subsidies to loss-making enterprises, make the currency convertible, and open the economy to trade. This kind of economic medicine produced an end to hyperinflation and generated strong economic growth in Poland, in Estonia, Slovenia. The same advice would have worked in Russia, but was not followed. Think of the role of rhetoric in all of this. Khrushchev's reforms were treated as a big lie. Gorbachev was associated with indecision and inconsistency. In 1992, the rhetoric of the Russian government was that the country would become a democratic market economy. But the reality suggested otherwise. If black markets still exist, then clearly there's legal restrictions in terms of a market economy developing. And if we can see capital flight taking place, then the reforms are obviously signalling that there's a lack of genuine commitment to them. Any transitional government faces a serious problem, which is, how do we generate credible commitment that these reforms are permanent? Was the Bolshevik plan credible? Yes, it was. But was Boris Yeltsin a credible reformer? Perhaps not. Yeltsin had an opportunity to make significant political changes following the failed 1991 coup. But he waited until December 1993 for new congressional elections and a constitution. Gerard Rowland said a possible honeymoon for reformers had already been dissipated. January the 2nd, 1992, around 80% of prices were freed, and by the end of 1992, inflation was 1,600%. Some of this is reflecting the fact that these goods are relatively scarce, and the abolition of price controls is allowing the market to tell us which goods are scarce and helping the price system to tell us about the relative scarcity of resources. But part of that hyperinflation was the consequence of actions by the central bank. At the time the central bank was accountable to the Congress of People's Deputies, they were in opposition to shock therapy. It wasn't accountable to Yeltsin. In Poland, inflation had settled after the initial surge, but in Russia, the central bank under Viktor Goroshenko carried on printing money. The claims that price liberalization would lead to a temporary surge in inflation were being undermined by the monetary expansion that aimed at mitigating the fall in living standards. Money supply growth did then become more constrained. Inflation fell to 130% in 1995 and 25% in 1996. But this was because the control of the money supply was being done on a more macroeconomically stabilized basis, which wasn't being done earlier on. The retreat of the state was not so much a deliberate policy of liberal reformers as a result of the collapse of Soviet state institutions. This began in 87, accelerated in 91, and was before Yeltsin's administration had come into power. That's to quote Peter Rutland. Branko Milanovic has said, Yegor Gaidar, who is the economic advisor to Yeltsin, in early 1992 had no option but to liberalize prices lest the country falls into famine. So horrendous were the conditions at the time. Releasing those prices was not really an option otherwise, but having control of the money supply to avoid having persistent hyperinflation was a choice. Now, Peter Betkin has said the problem with Yeltsin's shock therapy was that it applied too little voltage. Any reform process is a matter of credibility, and the rhetoric of liberalization needs to be accompanied by deep, genuine, and credible structural reforms. The signal that prices were free was actually a deceit. Financial markets recognized this and just didn't believe the words that were being said. At the time, free market economists like Larissa Piasheva were making this very point. The monetary expansion in 1994 was undermining the legitimacy of the central bank, resulting in the collapse of the ruble. The state retained controls of the supply of resources, corruption became rife, entrepreneurship was being blocked. The price liberalization began in earnest in January 1992, but already by March, Yeltsin was condemning profiteering and imposing quantity limits on sales. The rhetoric was outperforming and outpacing the actual reforms. Russia implemented roughly half of the policy package associated with the Washington Consensus. So while the Washington Consensus was somewhat slow and underperforming in some contexts, it was obviously going much faster ahead of the pace of reforms in Russia. The important thing is that Russia outcomes shouldn't be used as evidence for the failings of transition generally, because those countries that were outperforming what Washington Consensus was advocating were doing better than what Russia was doing. The 1996 election was incredibly important. Igor Malyshenko said, "I would rather elect the corpse of Yeltsin than Gennady Zyuganov." Malyshenko was the co-founder of NTV, died mysteriously in Spain in 2019. And television played a key role in the rise of Putin. Putin was severely criticized over his handling of the Kursk disaster and decided to take control of independent TV stations. In particular, he went after Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky enabled Putin's ascension and covered up the Moscow apartment bombings, which many people linked to people within Putin's circle. Khodorkovsky admitted that he was being duped. He thought that Putin was a liberal like Yeltsin and underestimated Putin's desire for power. Khodorkovsky played a critical role in the television effect and the media coverage that was introduced in 1996. This 1996 election was important because there was a real genuine chance that the communists could win back power. I think there's a number of different interesting counterfactuals we can think of. Of course, the Gorbachev counterfactual is if he wasn't engaged in perestroika. But 1991 is when we see this failed coup, which could have obviously seen the communists return. Yeltsin deals with the 1993 constitutional crisis. This was the point where the super-presidential constitution comes out. Some would point to this being the early onset of the types of powers that Putin would later come to exploit. Others would say that this was no different from Argentina or Brazilian-style democracy. Schleifer and Treisman have made that view. Another key counterfactual is in 1996, which is the election where the media really did stand behind Boris Yeltsin because the alternative was deemed so much more worse. The communists, Primakov, could have taken over. The reformists, such as Stepashin, could have taken over from Yeltsin. And as we'll see, it was in fact Putin that did so. A Stepashin presidency would have been far milder, less likely to see the rollback of freedoms that Putin's regime led, according to Catherine Belton. But these were the critical incidents from the 1991 coup, the 93 constitutional crisis, and the 96 election. How bad were the 90s in Russia? Well, according to Anders Asland, Russia was never as free, open, and colourful as in the 1990s. According to Schleifer and Treisman, in almost all developing capitalist economies, and even in most developed countries, the largest firms are either state or family controlled. This is overwhelmingly true of middle-income countries, such as Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, Malaysia, South Africa, but also some developed countries like Italy, Singapore, and Sweden. Compared to these, Russia doesn't seem too different. The system of political ownership and control has been referred to as crony capitalism, even though it's associated with some rapid economic growth in situations like Malaysia and South Korea. But I think it's important to read Yeltsin's apology to see what comes next. Boris Yeltsin said to the Russian people, "I want to ask your forgiveness for the dreams that have not come true, and for the things that seemed easy but turned out to be excruciatingly difficult. I am asking for your forgiveness for failing to justify the hopes of those who believed me when I said that we would leap from the grey, stagnating totalitarian past into a bright, prosperous, and civilized future. I believed in that dream. I believed that we could cover the distance in one leap. We didn't. The question I'm going to ask is, how culpable were the oligarchs in all of this? An oligarch is a business person who, to quote Guriev and Ryshinsky, controls sufficient resources to influence national politics. We can think of oligarchs as the equivalent of an industrial tycoon. They are a unique constituency because they are also the only Russian owners who can afford to invest and restructure Russian industries in very hostile business environments. Guriev and Ryshinsky also say oligarchs have weakened Russia's economy by stripping assets from Russian firms and sending money abroad, and also by bringing the ideas of private property and corporation into disrepute. It's interesting to note the damage caused by oligarchs not only in terms of their economic actions, but also the rhetoric in terms of what that makes people think about the economic system. Many of the oligarchs were young entrepreneurs who started with very little, and then, to quote Guriev and Ryshinsky again, converted Soviet manufacturing enterprises into successful modern capitalist firms. It's important to know the right benchmarks though. The industries where oligarchs made their wealth typically were highly concentrated ones. One of the reasons why they were highly concentrated though was because of economies of scale, so not necessarily because they were monopolies. These companies were quite large, certainly large relative to other Russian companies, but not necessarily large on global standards. And even though these companies were very large in terms of the Russian economy, many of them were subject to global competition. So 30 to 90% of output was exported in this period in Russia. And so if there were turnaround operations in these companies, it was telling us something about the value creation of these industries, given that they were subject to global competition. One thing we could say, therefore, is that there's no real antitrust element here, that a lot of these Russian oligarch companies were subject to competition, and economic factors explain their size. Also, when we're studying oligarch wealth, to realize that it's a lot more transparent than political wealth. So to some extent, the reason why we're seeing such massive increases in inequality and focus on these tycoons is because previously the wealth of political elites was being hidden, but the wealth of business elites is more visible and transparent. There's an argument to be said that oligarchs played an important role. Oligarchs outperformed other private Russian owners by around 8% in terms of total factor productivity growth. And this growth was not just because they were cost-cutting and cutting labour. Oligarchs have managed to produce more output holding constant the change in inputs, according to Guriev and Ryshinsky. Oligarchs do better than other domestic owners, and almost as well as foreign-owned ones. Very few people claim that Russia at the time needed more foreign-owned businesses, which tend to be more productive in use, but the oligarchs were an interesting middle ground, where they delivered some of the benefits of foreign ownership in terms of restructuring, but whilst keeping it still national enterprise. There was a lot of resentment towards these tycoons amongst the general public now, but at the time mostly from the KGB. They saw Yeltsin as a drunken buffoon, a mid-ranking Communist Party official who danced to the tune of the West and was now handing the country's strategic enterprises to a corrupt gang of rapacious businessmen, to quote Catherine Belton. But no, this was because the KGB were being undermined. They were being squeezed out. It's not obvious whether the people of Russia are better off under an oligarchy or a kleptocracy, but we shouldn't be listening to the KGB's criticisms of their competition as being what's interests of the general public. Anders Asler said that whilst most Russians blamed Yeltsin for the collapse of the Soviet Union and Gaida for hyperinflation and Chubey for the emergence of the oligarchs, and all three for corruption, They gave no credit to them for building a market economy that delivered a decade of unprecedented economic growth. The KGB, though, came for the tycoons. Within the first few days of Putin's rule, Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned the TV channel NTV, was raided. He was told he'd need to sell his media empire to the state-controlled Gazprom for $473 million in debts and $300 million in cash, or go to jail, according to Catherine Belton. She said, Putin's Kremlin had taken back control of the airwaves. The freewheeling media of the Yeltsin years was no more. Putin had proposed a law that would allow the president to dismiss any regional governor who was under criminal investigation. But Putin was also responsible for being able to open criminal investigations. Belton, one by one, Putin's men were being put in charge of swathes of the economy, while the Siloviki were taking over the court system, the federal tax system, and other branches of government previously out of reach to them. The Siloviki here roughly translates as men of force, or in Irish, hard men. She also says the underground KGB financial networks that promoted Communist Party interests during Soviet times would manage and disperse cash for strategic needs of the Putin regime. So these oligarchs, their time was up. The critical factor that led to the rise of the oligarchs in the first place was the loans for shares scandal. And this was one of probably three phases of mass privatization. The first phase of Russian privatization we can think of as being spontaneous privatization. And this was occurring pre-transition. Peter Rutland says, incumbent directors took over the de facto control of state enterprises and started running them for their own personal profit. Anders Aslan says that in 1991, a skilled operator could buy oil in Russia at an official price of $1 per ton and then sell it abroad at $100 per ton. These early big fortunes were being made at the expense of the state. We then see the actual transition process take place, and mass privatization occurs between 1992 and 1995. The mass privatization scheme was launched by Anatoly Chubey, with strong support from a team of US economists that were advising. Russian citizens received 148 million privatization checks, i.e. vouchers, and these were worth around 10,000 rubles per person. By the summer of 1994, 16,500 enterprises with more than 1,000 workers had been privatized. In 1995, there were 920,000 privatizations. This was the biggest privatization that the world had ever seen, according to Anders Aslan. The mass voucher program ended around 1994, and around 70% of the economy had been privatized at that point. Notice though, the most profitable firms, the most valuable firms, such as in oil, gas, and other commodities, weren't included in this period. Also notice that workers and managers were able to acquire the majority of shares in their own firms. So this deviated from the Czech model of privatization, which favoured outsiders, and the main reason was it was a political compromise. It was considered as a giveaway to those insiders to have their support. This played a big role in the rise of the oligarchs, who essentially became either an up-and-coming hustler into some kind of insider. The third phase of Russian privatization starts kind of in 1995, and this is the loan for shares scandal. This was introduced by presidential decree, i.e. not supported by parliament, and was a simple means of obtaining electoral support from the oligarch. As already mentioned, the 1996 election was critical because Yeltsin felt under sincere pressure from communists. This was the deal that was done to take the crown jewels of the Russian state that hadn't been part of the privatization process to be able to generate the support from the oligarch. Now, there were some problems with privatization in Russia. Compared to other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, in Russia, the privatization process was quite slow, certainly corrupt, and quite self-defeating. It often led to this inside ownership. So managers typically had around 20% of stock. Employees had around 40% of stock. Robert Skidelsky says, as a result of privatization, managers and workers ended up owning about 70% or more of each company. Workers and management could then collude to maintain their existing position with subsidies from the central bank. In typical large firm privatizations, just 14% of shares would be owned by new outsiders. The main problem with privatization, though, is that we simply don't know which of these companies are successful, which of them are valuable, and which aren't. If we knew the actual value of the companies being sold, we wouldn't need privatization. Privatization is the market response to uncover the value of assets that haven't been trading in the first place. Perhaps botched privatization is the only alternative to no privatization, and perhaps it's superior. Bill Browder talks about how consolidation of vouchers was particularly profitable. Of these vouchers that were given to the general public in part of the mass privatization phase, although they were given away for free, there was massive gains from consolidating them into larger units. So he talks about how you could buy individual vouchers from the general public for around $7 for a bottle of vodka, maybe for a few slabs of pork. But then if you buy up blocks of vouchers in small villages and then sell them, you can get $12 consolidated in larger towns. If those larger consolidated amounts get packaged into 1,000 or 2,000 lots, which you can then sell in Moscow, at the periphery of the official exchanges, you'd get around $18 per voucher. And those vouchers would probably be worth about $20 each if they'd been consolidated into bundles of 25,000 or more. So whilst it is the case that Russian individual members of the public were handing over these vouchers for very small sums of money, at individual levels, those vouchers weren't worth much. It took the kind of entrepreneurial insight of being able to package them into larger units and then deliver them to where people were willing to pay the money to be able to get the value of those vouchers that had been handed out. This third phase of privatization was the loans for shares scandal. It was proposed in 1995 due to an election to take place in 1996 with a real chance communists would return to power. The idea was that Russian business people would give the government loans in exchange for shares in strategic assets that could later be sold. Many of the companies were bought back by the people giving the loans, thus making them very wealthy. Vladimir Yakunin said all the profits were going to private pockets, no taxes were paid, it was looting, pure and simple, although he was a KGB officer with an incentive to exaggerate. A lot of the criticism centered on the belief that the oligarchs were using treasury funds that were held in the banks that they were controlling. But notice this was exactly the model that Putin subsequently began to adopt. 12 companies were involved in the loans for shares scandal. 12 companies were privatized, but only 3 changed principal owners, which were Yukos, Novosilk Nickel and Sibneft. They were privileged insider privatization, but as Anders Asland says, nothing else was sold for more. The policy had nothing to do with a pro-market agenda. It was not economic advice as to how to conduct a privatization, but was part of a contemporary political battle. Yeltsin needed to pacify groups of supporters. At the time, the media was free, and therefore being able to get the support of people that were influential in the media was incredibly important. According to Anatoly Chubey, tomorrow I would do the same, if only for winning the battle with the communists, which it was at the time. This was an existential moment in the transition process in Russia, where it could have slipped back into the communist system. You can say that this was the real turning point. This was the point at which the economy irrevocably transferred into the hands of these new tycoons. Catherine Belton also says that this was the moment where these young tycoons had outmaneuvered their former KGB masters. So whilst it was the KGB that had the head start in the transition process, the loan for shares was the culmination of these new tycoons who'd benefited through the privatization process, getting their hands on the crown jewels of the Russian state. The accusation that the state assets were given away and that the KGB operatives didn't have access to the type of funds that the tycoons had. So notice that the criticism that the KGB were making was that they were being outbid by the oligarchs and the tycoons, not so much that the oligarchs or the tycoons weren't paying as much as they were. Belton says this was the kernel of the KGB's later revanche. Notice, the loan for shares scandal wasn't really the beginning of the end. I'd argue that it was a brief glimpse of an oligarch that ultimately wasn't strong enough to endure. It was the moment when the oligarchy was more powerful than the security services, and it was a rare insight into what type of economy that would look like. There's also no evidence that Western academics were coming to advise Chubey using American security services as an insight. It's worth looking at some specific examples of some of these oligarchs. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was perhaps the most famous. He was a member of the Communist Youth League and formed a cooperative in 1987 as part of the new policies that Gorbachev was implementing to try to restore and rebuild communism. It was a private business, but it was permitted in parts of the economies that had the biggest shortages. In 1988, it was permitted for cooperatives to enter the raw materials trade. So again, he took advantage of Gorbachev's loosening of the economic system. This was a highly profitable business, but it was also a very valuable business. So this was not so much looting the state as exploiting communist inefficiencies and improving the marketplace. Possibly he was helped by existing KGB networks and capabilities, and it only really became his business in 1993. Khodorkovsky then obtained the fertilizer plant Appetit in 1994 through his group Menetep. 1998 was key because it became a free-for-all. This was where the genie's let out the bottle and he really takes control. He was one of the first to open a financial business, which was a bank. He was benefiting from a loophole at the time that allowed banks to exchange rubles for dollars at the official rate, which was 65-1, but then he could sell computers at the market rate of 40-1. Owning a bank allowed him to engage in this hard currency trading. This bank, arguably, was an important conduit for the transfer of Communist Party wealth, and Khodorkovsky supported Yeltsin's presidential bid. Part of the reason he became subsequently such a large target was his transparency. Belton says he had been one of the first Russian tycoons to publicly disclose their business holdings. She also says, though Khodorkovsky is no saint and makes an unlikely freedom fighter, the West's backing of the Kremlin's takeover of his company and its usurping of the rule of law facilitated and domination of Putin's security men and furthered their integration into Western financial markets. By 1993, Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia, net wealth of around $15 billion. Ultimately, he bet his life that Putin wouldn't be brash enough to arrest him. In 2003, he openly challenged Putin on live TV to explain where an overpayment made by Rosneft had gone. Now, at that point, Anders Åslund argues, it wasn't clear whether or not Khodorkovsky was accusing Putin of benefiting from this deal or whether he was exposing people close to Putin. Khodorkovsky then sought to merge Yukos with Sibneft. He seemed to think that being on an even bigger scale would offer him more protection. It's likely that Roman Abramovich would use that merger to then try to get control of both companies back to Putin. In October 25, 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested whilst his plane was refueling. According to Catherine Belton, this was the moment when Russia's political and economic course turned irrevocably away from the Western-led global integration and took a course of its own, heading to collision with the West. Khodorkovsky's trial started in June 2004. Yukos, the company, was confiscated. Perhaps his biggest mistake was that he was thinking of himself as being the owner of Yukos. As lawyer Dmitry Golubov said, though, privatization didn't create legitimate property. Other oligarchs understood this well. None of them claimed they were actually owners of their business. But it prompted the beginnings of a process whereby which the Siloviki expropriated and tried to reclaim Russian state assets from the tycoons. The main weapon for Putin was the looming threat of retrospective tax fraud charges. He could charge any of these oligarchs for tax fraud. It's quite amazing to think in hindsight the way in which this was played out in the West. Anders Åslund says, incredible as it appears in hindsight, many foreign investors believed that Putin was establishing law and order in Russia and that Khodorkovsky was a crook. It tells us something about the public's attitudes towards tycoons and industrial wealth, that they, at the time, seemed to think that having Khodorkovsky in jail was a good thing and showed Putin was serious about law and order. Was Khodorkovsky naive? When speaking in 2022, he said, "It would have been nice for me to say that he was different before, because what that would mean I didn't make a mistake. He, Putin, has changed, of course, but fundamentally, he remained what he was, a KGB person and a gangster, which is one and the same. He's a very talented person who can impress the person he's speaking to with what they want to see. When people laugh at George W. Bush for saying, 'I looked the man in the eye and found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy,' I never laugh because I didn't see Putin for what he was in reality." Åslund, no big Russian businessman dared to stand up against Putin after Khodorkovsky's arrest. Another important oligarch is Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky helped Putin's vault to power, in the words of Catherine Belton. He thought Putin would lead for 4 years while an opposition movement developed and a democracy could begin to function. At the time, parts of the Yeltsin economic team were very much engaged in democratic forces. Anatoly Chubay had the Union of Right Forces Party, Grigory Yavlinsky had Yabloko, but then both of those parties were completely wiped out in elections in December 2003. This left Berezovsky as being exposed. He was a lone voice of dissent against Putin's early clampdown on oligarchs. Berezovsky resigned from his position in parliament ultimately because he didn't want to participate in the imposition of authoritarian rule. That's a quote from Catherine Belton. Another famous oligarch, Roman Abramovich. Abramovich, a seemingly shy gentleman, an oil trader, an associate of Berezovsky, and close to the Yeltsin family. Quite quickly, he seemed to have bowed to Putin. When he bought Berezovsky's shares in ORT and then sold them to a Putin ally, this seemed to reveal what his function was. Abramovich sold Sibneft to Gazprom for $13.1 billion. This was deemed to be a high price at the time and therefore claims of a kickback. Sibneft were engaged in just as aggressive tax planning as Yukos, but because of the connections, there's no surprise as to why he wasn't being singled out and being made to pay the fees. There's an interesting debate about why he bought Chelsea Football Club. Some thought it might have been because he was trying to protect his fortune from Putin, moving it to London. Some others think that he's really working for Putin in the sense that he was gaining access to British high society, generating a platform on a global stage, which could, ultimately led to Russia's hosting of the FIFA World Cup. It seems unclear the extent to which Abramovich was useful, used, or worse. Let's consider the comparative example of the oligarchs. Lots of Western companies came into Russia, but most of them failed. And this is because very few people have a combination of the two main things you need to survive in this type of environment. Firstly, you need sound management skills. You need the ability and the capacity to be able to run a large organization, which is difficult. Secondly, you need the knowledge of the local norms and the country-specific situation to do business in Russia at this time. Oligarchs were the only people that had these twin skill sets of being able to navigate Russian politics, but also be able to manage effectively large organizations. Could argue that if anything, oligarchs were too weak in Russia because their importance dwindles over time. The post-1998 oligarchs seem to be a very different type from the ones that came to fame during the loan for shares scandal. The sovereign debt crisis in 1998 caused several banks to collapse. It impacted the wealth of the oligarchs who'd supported Yeltsin. Oil prices rose from $12 in 97 to $148 2008. According to Peter Rutland, by breaking the political power of the oligarchs, the crisis made possible the rise of a new statist elite under Vladimir Putin. And we can think about how the type of oligarchs changed over time. From 1985 to 1991, the oligarchs were kind of insiders. They were a combination of bureaucrats and opportunists that were coming into the market and benefiting from transition. From 1992 to 1996, this is the oligarch as tycoons. These were still opportunists, but also, to a large extent, effective managers. From 1998, it changes. This is the era of the kleptocracy. These are managers, but essentially puppets. And those oligarchs have moved from 1985 to 1981, 92 to 96, 98, three very different types of oligarchs. The insiders, the tycoons, the kleptocrats. This slow process of transition was creating the scope for exploitation. Grigory Yavlinsky said, "Business is people who are playing the game which the state is offering them. The state sets the rules, businesses respond." I think a contrarian view of some of these things is that when we actually look at the biggest scandals, when we look at the loan for shares scandal, especially having what's happened since then, we can say that these oligarchs, when they were in the tycoon phase, are either overstated or, contrary to the economic advice based on the transition process, or the fault of the politicians, as opposed to the managers. We can look at some specific examples of companies that went through. Firstly, let's look at Norilsk Nickel. This is a state-owned mining company based above the Arctic Circle. In 1995, it was making profits of $1.2 billion. It was then privatized in 1997. Those involved in buying out the company included oligarchs such as Vladimir Potanin. He extended a loan of just $170 million, and then when the government defaulted, he won it at auction for little more than that. But within a year, Norilsk Nickel had paid all salary debt, it had restructured its outstanding debts, which was worth several $billion, and began a crisis management process. There'd been no reinvestment in the company for 20 years. Potanin had invested $1 billion back into the plant in the early 2000s. As of 2018, Potanin still owned and controlled the company. Even though the price at which it exchanged hands was deemed to be low in market rates, Anatoly Chubey said, "Don't forget that with the sale of Norilsk Nickel, we got the first $170 million. It was absolutely fantastic. It helped the federal budget a lot because the budget situation was critical. Was it a small fee? Perhaps, but relatively important in terms of what it did to the Russian budget at the time. We can also think of the case of Yukos. Yukos is an oil and gas company set up in 1993 and produced 20% of Russia's oil, which is around 2% of global production. Khodorkovsky took control, having lent the government $159 million for a 45% stake, and then $150 million for an additional 33% stake. The minority stake was privatized for $310 million. It was, quote, knee-deep in debt. By 2000, the annual tax bill was $6 billion. Profits were stashed offshore in the Menatap group. This was probably a legitimate response to such an unstable investment climate at the time. Tax schemes that were being used were legal at the time, and Yukos were paying similar rates of tax to other privately owned oil companies. In 2002, $1.26 billion was invested in property, plant and equipment. In 2003, the company had a market cap of $45 billion. Yukos had engaged in a genuine corporate turnaround. It hired Western executives, restored output to pre-Soviet collapse levels, and it invested in quality equipment and the latest technologies. According to a Planet Money article, Yukos brought Western-style management and transparency. Its bankruptcy was because of tax issues with the Russian government. Yukos had financed boarding schools for orphans, computer classes for village schools, and civil society programs for journalists and politicians. It was dissolved in 2007, having been seized by Rosneft, and they had obtained the main oil field in an auction. Now, according to Planet Money, Khodorkovsky bought a 78% in Yukos for $310 million, even though it was worth an estimated $5 billion. But this poses a fundamental question, which is, how much of the value of the company is a function of the property rights regime in which it operates? How much of the value of Yukos is the oil in the ground versus the organizational capabilities of the company? Surely they're intertwined. Oil in the ground is worth nothing without an expectation of being able to excavate and sell it without it then being appropriated. We can't really compare the value of capital goods in two different economic systems. And this is one of the fundamental problems of trying to decide what the value of these assets were when they were being handed over. We can also think of the case of Sibneft. This was an oil giant that's now part of Gazprom, bought by Roman Abramovich for $100 million. 40% of Gazprom was sold for $100 million, although Gazprom was worth 10 times more than Sibneft. Schleifer and Treisman point out that under oligarch control, they made capital expenditures of $959 million in 2002, later sold to the state seemingly at a fair market price. According to Boris Berezovsky, though, I have no doubt the profits from the sale of Sibneft will be shared between Abramovich and Putin, as well as among several other individuals. So even those companies that did receive high fees, it's not necessarily the case that the high fees being received were beneficial for the Russian public. Greater asset stripping occurred in state-controlled companies. Gazprom's former management were accused of stealing assets because of their complex network of trading companies. Aeroflot's reported assets actually fell from 1998 to 2001, and Aeroflot remained state-owned. According to Schleifer and Treisman, the leading oligarch-controlled oil companies outperformed other oil firms such as Lukoil, which remained under Soviet-era management. It suggests that the success was due to better management and not just the increasing oil prices. In fact, the claim that the oligarchs privatized companies in order to strip assets and are impeding economic growth has it precisely backwards. The oligarchs stripped assets from state-controlled companies in order to buy others in privatization. Indeed, the concern with such theft from state firms was one of the reasons to accelerate privatization in 1992. By the end of the 1990s, these young oligarchs, these young tycoons, were actually turning around the Soviet legacy of falling production, deep debts, and long-term neglect, according to Belton. The 7 bankers outran their former KGB masters to take over much of the economy. These 7 bankers were famously were famously labelled by Boris Berezovsky, who'd bragged to the Financial Times that himself and 6 other Russian oligarchs controlled half of the Russian economy. Now, that number's probably inflated, and so even though it was very self-serving for Berezovsky to overstate his power and influence, many Western commentators took it at face value and overestimated the control of the oligarchs. Belton says at this point the forces of the KGB appeared to be receding into the background. By 1994, the great mob war was starting to fade. New big businessmen, commonly called oligarchs, had set up their own security services. In 1994, murder on the streets of Russia, of Moscow, was seen to be increasingly a thing of the past because despite the breakdown in state institutions, the private business sector had set up their own private security, which was dealing with the problem. However, in St. Petersburg, according to Belton, isolated from the gold rush of Moscow's economic boom, the forces of the KGB were exerting far greater control in a city where the economy was tougher and darker in the violent scrabble for cash. Vladimir Guzinski is an important figure in this. In the 1980s, Guzinski was a taxi driver. He made some money buying and selling copper bracelets. And then in the early 1990s, he started to engage himself in the burgeoning, increasing real estate market in Moscow. By 1993, he'd started a newspaper. He had Russia's first private television station, NTV. It included a satirical show which mocked Vladimir Putin. By 2000, armed agents in camouflage and ski masks had raided NTV's offices. If we look at the period from 1995 to 1999, lots of oligarch wealth had come from investments in oil, mines, and metal companies. And of course, a major reason for their success was a commodity price boom that took place during this period. According to Jordan Gans-Morse, by the mid-1990s, the organised crime that had emerged out of the onset of transition had been defeated. And by the early 2000s, the rule of law had started to take hold. However, this was undermined by the advance of state predation. This 1995 to 1999 period had seen some progress on legal institutions. So commercial courts had been established in 1992. An independent judiciary had been enshrined in the 1993 Constitution. Laws on bankruptcy, security markets and joint stock companies had happened. And according to Catherine Hendley, by 1997, for the most part, the legal infrastructure needed for a market economy had been created. One downside, though, was a lot of that judicial reform had increased centralization. So judges had become slightly more dependent on presidential administration. They'd become less dependent on regional governors. And also, large violations of tax laws still resulted in criminal proceedings. And so this left, according to Anders Aslund, a large loophole that the Yukos affair numbed the tax police reform. In 1998, there was a financial crisis. August 17th, 1998, the government in Russia defaulted on some $70 billion of domestic treasuries, although not on its external debt. The major economic turmoil that was caused by the sovereign debt crisis of 1998 was not a natural consequence of the transition process and should be kept analytically separate from what was happening in terms of the internal restructuring of the economy. The main reasons for the default in 1998 were probably fiscal profligacy, so too much spending by the government, open capital flows, and global problems that were affecting global markets. The default actually helped to restructure the economy in Russia at the time. It was probably something that laid the foundation for subsequent growth because so much of those debts had been cancelled. It had levelled the playing field and it had imposed a harder budget constraint on many enterprises. Anders Aslund says, the period 2000 to 2003 represented the height of Russia's market economy. This was a time of macroeconomic balance and competitive markets. He said, Russia maintained free capital outflows since 2006. The official tolerance to capital outflows is remarkable given the great and sharp outflows in 2008 and again in 2014. The best explanation, however, was that the main beneficiaries of those capital outflows was the rulers themselves. So whilst it could be argued that international capital markets let the Russian economy exposed to these types of movements. Another argument is that the Russian regime itself is dependent on having the capability of moving sums outside of the country. It may be the case that impartial, neutral economic advisors would say those capital controls should be a little bit tighter, and that would restrict some of the political ability to be able to siphon off wealth from the country. The IMF began working in Russia in 1993, i.e. after the transition process had begun. The pressing concern, in the words of Padma Desai, was to salvage a building in flames, not to redesign the architecture. So in Russia, the IMF stuck to its kind of one-size-fits-all rules. The policy stance was in terms of a feasible mixture of monetary control, of exchange rate management and capital mobility. And the advice that the IMF were given was fairly standard IMF advice that it would give to most countries. During this period, public debt fell dramatically and the Russian economy was doing quite strong. We can think of different types of corruption and how this plays a role in the period. One distinction we can make is between the grand corruption that takes place with the interaction between politicians and big business, then the political corruption, which is when people lobby politicians for favours. This is common in non-transition countries as well. We can think of the regulatory corruption, which is where SMEs and mid-level managers are paying bribes to get licenses or permits or things like this. This is very important in the sense that it's an important source of salary for those mid-level bureaucrats, reduces SME growth rate and impacts the dynamic nature of the economy. At the lower level, we can think of petty corruption. So this is something that existed throughout communism, where we see small bribes being handed over for daily transactions. Of course, there's much more petty corruption that takes place than grand corruption, but the absolute value of each of those is probably broadly equivalent. Branko Milanovic makes a distinction between access money, grand theft, speed money, and petty theft. And so whilst access money, which is when we give permission to capitalists to engage in big projects, can actually be growth enhancing in the short run because it's a means by which business gets done. This is obviously in the longer run going to have problems in terms of capital misallocations. Grand theft, speed money, petty theft, these are almost unambiguously bad for economic growth, where grand theft refers to large-scale embezzlement. Speed money is the street-level corruption, such as obtaining a shop license faster, or the petty theft, avoiding a fine by paying a bribe. I think we can really split Russian transition into two main stages. The first is the oligarch-friendly capitalism. The second is the state capitalism. The oligarch-friendly capitalism is the kind of Wild West. It's when the tycoons had power over the KGB. It was when the state was being captured by private business. But by 2003, that was over. That first stage of Russia's transition had finished. Yevgeny Yasin has said the second stage then really began. This was the state capitalism where instead of being the Wild West, there was much more structure and order. It was when the KGB had taken control back from the tycoons. It was when the private businesses were being captured by the state. This was when Putin's deal was very clear and explicit, which was to say, you stay out of politics and I will not go back into the events of privatization. It was when Russia stopped being an oligarchy. The major endeavor of Putin's second term was to build state capitalism, and this was how he did it. It was to replace oligarch-friendly capitalism with the basis of a kleptocracy. We can say that by around 2014, this process was complete. Russia had completed the transition to its own version of state capitalism, according to Anders Asland. I think it's important to recognize, therefore, that when the state capitalism had superseded the oligarch-friendly capitalism, what had been left and what had been lost? The positive role of oligarchs is often neglected. The organized crime emerged spontaneously because of a lack of rule of law. It wasn't to exploit the situation, it was to resolve a situation. So the murder rate doubled from 1989 to 1993 because the government's monopoly of violence had broken down. But after that point, private enforcers outcompeted the state and established themselves instead. The oligarchs didn't enjoy being exploited by crime, so they organized their own security. And Asland reports that by 1995, they'd squeezed out organized crime. The Russian murder rate peaked in 1993. Racketeering fees gradually fell. The Russian government couldn't compete with private security, and so effectively they legalized it. But then within 7 years, the state had managed to reorganize itself and take back control and clamp down on those private security forces. Russian governments are now able to jail business people indiscriminately and arbitrarily. The difference between the oligarchs and the kleptocrats was that in the 1990s, to get rich, you actually had to go into business. The success was based on restructuring. It was based on leading a company into becoming a more efficient organization. Many business leaders that made their fortune in the 1990s saw themselves more as private equity investors perhaps than industrialists, but they were still actually contributing to the restructuring of organizations. By contrast, after Putin came to power, you got rich by entering the Kremlin. According to Yomyshav, some of my friends who work in the Kremlin now say with absolute sincerity how great it is that they can get so rich here. In the 90s, this was unacceptable. Now they go and work for the state to earn money. The oligarchs were responding to prevailing conditions. They didn't create those conditions, and they profited for as long as the transition window was open, after which they had to consolidate and invest and build their companies in a similar way in which Western companies are built. Schleifer and Treisman report that their audited financial statements, so their assets rose dramatically, especially since 1998. The major oligarchs have been investing hundreds of millions of dollars annually in their companies. In contrast to this, the asset stripping scandals occurred in companies that remained under state control. So Russia isn't an oligarchy anymore. An oligarchy implies some balance with different forces based on wealth, but in Putin's Russia, it's the central state that's in control, and there's no balance of power because Putin rules supreme. It's not an oligarchy, it's a kleptocracy. So where did this all go wrong? Maybe we should have recognized the damage being caused by the loans for shares scandal. Maybe we should have seen how this would feed into the subsequent rise of Putin. And maybe there was a lot of naivety about whether or not where that was going. Maybe NATO or similar should have moved eastwards as a credible deterrent. Maybe Europe should have stopped free riding on the United States. In 1991, there were just 12 members of the EU, and Russian Democrats wanted to join. The EU soon expanded to 15, including several Eastern European members, but the European Union turned its back quite clearly on Russia itself. Yeltsin was keen to join, but Helmut Kohl thought it was too big and too powerful to join that club. The EU provided just 1.2 billion euros worth of assistance to Russia from 1991 to 1999. So Russia and its neighbours have this interesting situation where some of them wanted a dependent and close relationship. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Tajikistan. Certainly the leadership wanted to remain close to Russia, whereas other neighbours wanted to minimise contact where possible. Potentially Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, more keen to go in their own direction. Don't think Russian backsliding was inevitable though. Anders Aslan said Russia went through a revolution and it had not been completed. The reversal to authoritarian political power was neither surprising nor inevitable. In the early 2000s, leading Russian private companies such as Yukos and Lukoil opted for transparency and good corporate governance. They formalized and publicized their ownership. They published audited financial statements, appointed independent directors, listed on international stock markets, and attracted minority shareholders. The erstwhile oligarchs were gentrifying at an amazing speed, and the public trading of their stocks enhanced their fortunes. If this process had continued, Russia might have been able to become a normal capitalist country with transferable ownership and democracy. What should Russia have done differently? Maybe Yeltsin should have dissolved the KGB rather than splitting it and weakening it. After all, democracies don't need a secret police. To quote Anders Aslan, Russians should finally carry out a proper decommunization, condemn Stalin's terror, and topple all the monuments of terrorists. Aslan also points out that there's other things that Russia could have done differently. As well as dissolving the KGB, they should have had an early founding election for parliament. They should have replaced the constitution rather than amending it. Maybe engage in earlier judicial reforms. They should have gained control of the central bank and broken up the ruble zone. Should have engaged more with the West to provide stronger support for reforms. Deregulation could have been quicker and more expansive. Privatization could have been adjusted to political demands. Notice these failures in the legal and the political realm that meant that the window of transition delivered some genuine improvements in the Russian economy, but not sufficient changes to prevent that further retrenchment back into authoritarian tendency. Russia is similar to the BRICS. Like Brazil and China, Russia is a large middle-income country. that's riddled with crony capitalism. We can think of some differences. China is more decentralized, it's faster growing and more innovative, or has been. Brazil has a stronger judiciary and has been more democratic. Russia has had slightly more freedoms in terms of the economic functioning. According to Asland, in a BRICS context, Russia stands out as having particularly centralized authoritarian politics, a large monopolistic state sector without interest in development or profits, and an elaborate crony system, while it performs well in terms of economic level, education, and openness. When we look to the future, we can see that Russia has a declining outlook. We can see this declining outlook in three different ways. Firstly, demographic. Russia has stagnant population growth. It's soon going to be overtaken by Ethiopia and Congo in terms of population size. Secondly, the declining outlook in Russia is economic. It's the sixth largest economy in 2017, but 12th largest in dollar terms, and 60th richest in terms of GDP per capita. This makes it a kind of upper middle income country, but one that's incredibly dependent on oil prices. And the third reason for the declining outlook is military. Russia has the third largest military expenditure as of 2016, although $69 billion is quite small compared to China, which is $215 billion, and tiny compared to the US, which is $611 billion. In terms of the military, Russia is stronger than any country in Europe and remains a nuclear superpower alongside the United States, but this is likely to fall as the economy struggles. Writing in 2019, Anders Aslan said, "Because of this declining outlook, for the Kremlin, the temptation might be overwhelming to exploit its military strength while it still can."